Awesome. Hey, all right. Welcome everybody. The Friday keynote at Nerd Summit 2021, sponsored by Last Call Media. Thank you all for coming. Today we've got Ethan Zuckerman for our 1 o'clock Friday keynote. Ethan Zuckerman is Associate Professor of Public Policy, Information and Communication at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and Director of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure. His research focuses on the use of media as a tool for social change, the use of media, new media technologies by activists and alternative businesses, and governance models for the internet. His talk today is titled, What Went Wrong with the Web and Who's Working to Make It Better? Ethan, thank you so much for joining us and giving us this talk, and I'll hand it to you to take it away.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to have the chance to share some of these ideas with you, and hope we can sort of use this as a way to have a robust conversation sort of after the fact. We're having this conversation at a very strange moment. I'm not used to giving keynotes from my office in my house. I will say one of the upsides of it are that I can wear my fuzzy turtle slippers in the process, which I rarely get to do in person. But it is also very challenging to sort of speak this way. You're always hoping with a keynote to sort of challenge and inspire people, and it's very hard to know what's working and what's not working in this sort of format. But in general, this is kind of a strange moment, not just the isolation that we're all experiencing from the pandemic and sort of doing things virtually, but a moment where I think a lot of people are feeling like many aspects of our society are not working nearly as well as we might hope that they would be. Whether it's the way that the US has handled the pandemic, whether it's our recent election, whether it's our political climate more broadly. Many people are starting to ask questions about whether the media and technology environment that's involved with all of this has something to do with this perhaps moment of crisis in society. We have just gone through a very unusual presidency during which we've had a leader who used the internet to almost an unprecedented degree, but has also used it in ways that are really troubling and problematic, to the point where, as people have been trying to figure out what happened as recently as January 6th, there's a lot of speculation that the storming of the US Capitol was organized, at least in major part, using the internet, using social media. At the very least, we know that the experience was live streamed, broadcast, and shared by people using these tools in one fashion or another. So there's really good reasons to sort of ask the question, what's going on with social media? What's going on with this particular moment in the internet? And there's a moment of what you might think of as techno panic. People really worried that technologies unchecked are having some corrosive effects on our society. This film, The Social Dilemma, has gotten a great deal of attention. It ends up featuring sort of a pair of arguments, one about the internet being potentially addictive and dangerous. The other part of it about the idea that the internet may be being used to manipulate our politics, as seen with sort of the scandals around Facebook's relationship with Cambridge Analytica. And you see sort of story after story of people trying to figure out how these technologies that have become quite central to our time online can turn out in many cases to be so problematic. This, sort of disturbing image comes from a story by a friend of mine, Siva Vajanathan, where he published an article called Making Sense of the Facebook Menace. I think you can hear from that title that he is not, in fact, particularly enthusiastic about the world that Facebook is bringing forward. I'm interested in sort of thinking about what are these sets of problems that have actually come to the fore around the internet in general and around social media specifically. And I wanted to talk about some of the ideas that I see people raising when they sort of ask the question, is the internet good for us? Is social media harming us in society? So here are sort of 5 critiques that I think come up pretty often. This idea that social media may be personally bad for us, that it's bad for journalism, that it's polarizing the electorate, that it's helping recruit extremists, and that it may actually be sort of breaking our collective shared reality. This idea that social media might be bad for us personally is really well articulated by Sherry Turkle. She's a professor at MIT, extremely thoughtful commentator on technology. One of the things that's interesting about Turkle is that early in her career, she wrote really favorably about online spaces. She was really interested in this idea that by interacting online, we could try out different identities, we could sort of explore who we are and who we want to be. She most recently has written a book around this idea that technology is actually making us very lonely, that it's isolating us, that we are replacing face-to-face connection in the days where we could be face-to-face connected with virtual connection, and that it's not nearly as satisfying. And so she worries that we're heading towards a state of loneliness and alienation. The guy directly above my head is Tristan Harris. He was Google's staff ethicist for about 3 years. He finally left the company. But his big argument is that many of the technologies that we end up using have been designed for addiction. He actually points to things like the slot machine industry and the ways in which technologies try to keep us clicking, try to keep us scrolling, the dark patterns that are used to try to keep us using social media again and again until we end up realizing that we're giving far too much time and attention to these products without necessarily even choosing to do so. There's an argument that social media, and particularly the rise of the advertising around it, is killing off journalism. For me, this graph ends up being pretty compelling. Those dark bars are advertising revenues for US newspapers. Newspapers are particularly important in the United States for news because they tend to do the bulk of the really substantial reporting. When investigative news breaks, it's almost always coming from the newspapers. So if they're losing huge amounts of revenue at the same time that Google and Facebook and others are gathering it, that does seem like something that we actually have to have a conversation about. Google and Facebook are very good at sharing news. They're not particularly good at reporting it. And if they are taking money away from the journalistic institutions that we count on to have a healthy and stable society, that seems like a problem that we're going to end up having to deal with sooner rather than later. There's all sorts of pushback on this. Maybe the news companies simply haven't dealt with the digital transition well. Not all of that revenue for Google and Facebook is being stolen away from news. But one way or another, newspapers are really struggling at a moment where we sort of need them more than ever. There are arguments out there made by friends of mine like Eli Pariser that what's really wrong with social media is that it is isolating us into filter bubbles and echo chambers. This argument about the echo chamber has been around for a while. It's an argument that if you are surrounded primarily by people who agree with you, who have the same perspective on the world as you do, that you will end up becoming increasingly more hostile to people who don't share your worldview, and you'll have a harder time connecting. The idea is that if you're only hearing from people who agree with you, you end up becoming more extreme. You end up sort of pushing towards those extremes. And Eli believes that the situation is getting worse in the era of the internet because the algorithms that govern what we see on a site like Facebook want us to keep clicking, they want us to keep scrolling, and therefore they don't like confronting us with dissenting viewpoints, uncomfortable information. they would much rather sort of surround us with the information that we want to hear. And so for Parser, we've gone from echo chambers, which occur naturally, to filter bubbles, which are sort of echo chambers that have been amplified by technology. Now, on a lot of this stuff, there's pushback on this. Some of the studies that have been done suggest that the algorithmic effects are much less than the choice effects, right? You're more likely to end up in an echo chamber because you choose to be in one by who you choose to listen to than you are by the algorithm. But it's still a legitimate concern that the networks that we're building are making it hard to hear dissenting voices and hard to hear alternative points of view. We have people starting to worry in a very real sense that extremists of all sorts, but particularly white nationalists, are recruiting online through social media. There's a remarkable article that I teach called "What Happened After My 13-Year-Old Son Joined the Alt-Right." I have an 11-year-old child, and it's not terribly hard to sort of imagine this happening. It's the story of a mother watching her child struggle at school, end up in a disciplinary situation, and sort of look for people who are sympathetic to him, and find himself in a corner of Reddit where he is being recruited and sort of groomed into a young misogynist and eventually a white nationalist. And there's real concerns that platforms don't know how to deal with this phenomenon or are simply choosing not to deal with this phenomenon. And there's real concerns in as much as we have seen people using some of the alternative platforms like 4chan and 8kun and then engaging in violence online. And then finally, there's this notion that's starting to emerge that the internet, because it's possible to share information that we are sympathetic to, that it's possible because we can surround ourselves only with voices that we want to hear, that reality itself seems to be breaking apart. And I started writing about this almost 2 years ago when QAnon looked like sort of a funny phenomenon that we could all laugh about. And I was trying to figure out how to understand this movement that simply just didn't believe the same reality that I spend my time in, but was living in a world in which many public figures were, they believed, involved in a global pedophile conspiracy. What we've now seen is that not only is that movement robust, but there have actually been moments where it has come into real life. We know that some of the people who are very active within that Q movement ended up embracing what many political scientists are now calling the big lie, the idea that the 2020 presidential election was stolen and that revolution was the appropriate response to it. So this question keeps coming up. It comes up in sort of public circles. It comes up in scholarly circles. Is social media bad for us as individuals? Is it bad for society as a whole? And as someone who studies this, I got to tell you, the definitive answer is that we really don't know. And we don't know not because we're dumb or not because we don't want to know. We don't know in part because it's really hard to know. It's incredibly difficult to study the big social media platforms. I actually just released a paper with some colleagues about ways in which people are trying to figure out, how do you pull data out of Facebook? How do you pull data off of Twitter, off of Gab, off of these different services, and try to actually make some intelligent judgments about what are the overall effects of social media. And it turns out that these platforms are often so uncooperative about sharing data about what's actually going on them, that some of the approaches that researchers are starting to take verge on breaking laws, right? They basically come down to scraping data off of platforms to find ways to study them. And we saw how valuable this can be in the wake of the January 6th riots. You saw people going onto Gab and Parler and sort of looking through those services to get footage of people who were actually there and getting an understanding of what had happened during the Capitol insurrection. but it's also not particularly well legally prepared to sort of do that. The other problem that we're having is that the studies that we're getting are more anecdata. They're not studies involving tens of thousands of users. When Eli Pariser published his book, The Filter Bubble, it opens up with an experiment where he asked half a dozen of his friends to try doing Google searches on their computers and sort of comparing the results. And while that's a great sort of thought experiment and sort of seeing how different things can be from one place to another, we tend to look for experiments with tens of thousands of users before we try to draw any strong conclusions about what's actually happening behaviorally. This is one of the few studies out there from a professor, Amy Orban, and Andrew Probisky. And this is a study that actually extrapolates from 3 very large studies. So it ends up putting 3 different studies together. It ends up with more than 350,000 participants. So it's one of the very biggest studies that we have to sort of learn from. What this study looks at is 350,000 young people online. And it tries to figure out, first of all, are they happy? So it starts with self-reported happiness. And then it tries to correlate different factors to reported happiness or unhappiness. So the punchline to the study is that there is a small but relevant association between heavy internet use and unhappiness in teenagers. So you can easily create a headline for this saying, heavy internet users as teens are unhappier than the average teenager. If you're a bad journalist, you go further and say teenagers are unhappy because they use the internet heavily. In fact, there's no causation there. It's possible that unhappy teens turn to the internet as a way of sort of trying to solve their problems. But what's really interesting is the effect size. They end up looking at other factors that may cause teenage unhappiness. It turns out that wearing glasses as a teenager is pretty strongly associated with being unhappy. Being short as a teenager, very much associated with being unhappy. Being fat, heavy association. Having a broken home, having heavy marijuana use, really, really high associations. The association between social media use and unhappiness is a tiny effect in comparison with the wearing glasses effect. In fact, it's so small that the factor that it's most similar to is eating a diet high in potatoes. So if you eat a lot of French fries, that's actually correlated with being, slightly unhappier than average as a teenager. It's about the same effect as heavy social media use. So that's not the sort of thing that people make documentaries about. It's not the sort of thing that people, go and write newspaper articles about because it's just not that big a finding. But what we're facing right now is this moment of technopanic, right? French fries aren't new. TikTok is new. And therefore, TikTok must be what's making our kids miserable. Online bullying must be what's making our kids miserable. This is not to say that there are not kids who have terrible experiences online and for whom the internet really has become a problem. What it is to say, though, is that when we do these studies with very large numbers of people, if we find associations between the internet and unhappiness, those effects tend to be pretty small and they tend to pale in comparison to other effects out there. But all that said, if we end up finding in the long run that social media is bad for individuals or that it's bad for society, we probably shouldn't be surprised. And the reason that we shouldn't be surprised is that the people who built these tools were not thinking about our happiness. They were not thinking about how they benefit us as a society. They were thinking about profit. So there's a book that's been really influential in this space over the last 2 years called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's written by Shoshana Zuboff, who's a brilliant scholar who has looked at what she sees as sort of the model underlying the internet. And it's basically a sophisticated version of something that we pretty much all heard, which is if you're not paying for something, you are not the customer, you're actually the product being sold. And Zuboff makes the argument that this model of surveillance capitalism, in which we expect things to be free, and in exchange, we give up a great deal of information about ourselves and our behaviors. And in effect, what we end up essentially doing is organizing ourselves for the benefit of the advertisers. We try to make ourselves as easy as possible for the advertisers to find us and to optimize their spending in sort of marketing to us. And I think I find this a very convincing model, and I find it a convincing model in part because I helped build it. If I go back into the past, from 1994 to 1999, I was one of the chief tech people at a company in Western Massachusetts called Tripod. It was one of 2 or 3 of the very first sites that specialized in user-generated content, that let you put information up on the web for free, supported by advertising. It was the #2 company in that space, behind a company called GeoCities. And one of our innovations was that we discovered that our advertisers really didn't like being on the same page as a user's homepage, because that homepage might be offensive, it might be poorly designed. They wanted to reach the people who were looking at those homepages, but they didn't want to be on the page. And so, based on my boss's instructions, I designed a way to open an ad at the same time as you opened a user homepage, which is something that we now call the pop-up ad. And I have terrible regrets about this. In fact, you could argue that the fact that I've been working on nonprofits and education ever since has a lot to do with my regrets over the pop-up ad. But it also means that this model of let's make everything free and let's try to ensure that as many people look at the web as possible is one that I've been thinking about and sort of participating in since the late 1990s. So when we look at this space and we try to figure out who's going to fix this, if these patterns are true, if it is true that social media isn't very good for us, that social media is harming society, who do we sort of count on to make these changes? Right now, we seem to be asking a lot of Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, some of the other people who've been involved with building these systems. But that's sort of a silly thing to ask for, right? These are the people who built the systems these ways. In fact, the systems are working quite well for these individuals. They're making quite a bit of money. These are incredibly valuable companies. Right now, what you can really expect out of a Facebook or a Twitter are some small changes around the edge, in part so they can make public pressure go away. Maybe you're expecting change from Senator Mark Warner, who's one of the people who's been putting together some of the more thoughtful internet legislation. Or maybe you're looking at the fact that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have threatened to change Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and make platforms liable for the content that they hold there. I would argue that looking to the government to solve some of these problems of social media is probably pretty unwise. What we've generally found is that most technology regulation tends to follow problems by anywhere from 2 to maybe 10 years. By the time legislation gets built to deal with some of the concerns that we're working on, they're often not our central concerns. And in this case, the legislation's particularly worrisome. It's very, very hard for Congress to regulate speech. In fact, the beginning of the First Amendment is Congress shall make no law, and then goes into the questions of restricting speech and freedom of assembly. This is a particularly challenging place to get the law to make change. But I think there actually are quite a few people trying very, very hard to make change in this space. And I'm actually enormously optimistic about some of the changes that can happen. I just think it involves people that we're not necessarily used to looking towards. So think of the rest of this talk as sort of an introduction to a set of people that you may not know about and you may not have heard about, who are trying very, very hard to sort of imagine and build alternate futures. These folks are sort of my superheroes who I see sort of taking on this set of challenges associated with social media as we know it. So the first of these people is this blue-haired individual here. Her name is Kathy O'Neill. She's a brilliant mathematician. She's got a doctorate in math, but she decided to go into industry and go into things like high frequency stock trading, and eventually came to the conclusion that we're facing a massive social problem around algorithmic accountability. That all around us, we have very powerful software algorithms that we have no way of evaluating whether they're fair, whether they're accurate, whether they're harming us in one fashion or another. Her book has been an inspiration for just a huge number of people who've started looking at algorithms and finding real harms associated with them. One of them is this young woman. This is Joy Bullum-Winnie. She's a doctoral student at MIT. She's actually my doctoral student. I'm the main advisor on her PhD. She's holding up a white mask, and this white mask has become quite famous within technology and social change circles. Joy was working with a piece of software that was supposed to identify her face. And the reason she was doing this was she was trying to create a video projection where her facial features would blend with that of a hero. She was trying to create a blend between her face and Serena Williams. And the problem was this program, which by the way had also been developed at MIT, it was actually developed down the hall from where our lab was, simply could not see her. It could see me, it could see a lot of other people in our lab, but it couldn't see her. And eventually, just for fun, she happened to have this dramatis personae mask around her office, and she put it on, and immediately it saw her very clearly. And what she realized was that a lot of these computer vision algorithms had been trained primarily on people whose skin is closer to my color than to her color. And as a result, these algorithms work really, really well on white men, and they work really, really poorly on Black women. And so she started reviewing the algorithms that were out there, looking at a couple of very common commercial software packages, and found that there was almost a 0% error rate in looking at pale males like me, and often a 40 to 50% error rate in identifying women of color in particular. Now, this is enormously important. These algorithms are starting to be used from everything from, fairly trivial examples. You pick up your phone and you're trying to shoot a portrait of someone. If it can't tell a person's there, you're not going to get the person. But they're also being used for things like matching people from surveillance footage to a lineup. And we're starting to see people getting arrested based on algorithms that quite clearly are not doing a very good job of identifying who they are. So she now has a project called the Algorithmic Justice League. This is a bunch of activists who are looking out there and trying to figure out how algorithms, particularly around computer vision, but in many other cases as well, how to audit them, how to make sure that they're accurate, and when they're not, how to call people out and get them to fix it. One of the other people who's sort of engaged with this work is this remarkable journalist named Julia Ongwen. She runs a publication called The Markup, which specializes in reporting on algorithms and their effects on society. And the real blockbuster that Julia had was reporting on an algorithm that got used in the courts in Florida. And this algorithm looks at certain factors of an individual. It does not look at race, but it does look at things like employment history. It looks at where you live. It looks at the nature of your crime, and it ends up doing a predicted recidivism score. And so the idea is, what are the chances that if you're released, you're going to go out and commit another crime? And Julia audited this algorithm and discovered that it pretty much gives white people a pass. It's really hard as a white person to get a high score on this and say you are a risk. Whereas if you're Black, there's actually a very, very high chance it's going to say, nope, you're going to commit a crime again, no bail for you. Not only did she check this, she also checked this against the results. And it turns out that not only is it racist, it's also racist and inaccurate. It actually ends up letting go a lot of white people who end up coming back and committing crimes. So Julia had enough of an experience with this that she's built a whole newsroom at the markup that looks at algorithms. And one of the places she looks at algorithms is within Facebook. She's actually built a set of tools that allow people to share their Facebook data with her and answer questions like, how is it different if Facebook thinks you're a Republican or thinks you're a Democrat? And the answer is you get lots more mis and disinformation if Facebook thinks you're a Republican. They deliver much more political data, particularly inaccurate political data and commentary, if they believe that you lean to the right. So think of this pack as the folks who are looking at the algorithms. They're looking at these questions around echo chambers. They're looking at these questions around filter bubbles, and they're starting to come up with some of the data to be able to solve them. There's other people who are looking at toxicity in online spaces. Tracy Chao is someone who's worked in the tech industry. She's worked for Pinterest. I believe she also worked for Quora. And she's a diversity advocate. She ends up arguing that companies need to hire more women, more people of color. And if you end up doing that work, you are almost certainly going to be harassed. And Tracy faces a lot of harassment on Twitter. And at a certain point, she started building a set of tools that let her encounter Twitter by looking for people who are going to call her racist names, people who are going to say hateful things about her, and just filtering them off to the side so she can sort of deal with them in a batch. And she's released it as software. It's called Block Party. It's actually one of the most useful tools out there if you're experiencing harassment on Twitter. You can set it up. If you're experiencing really heavy harassment, you can actually work with Block Party to get them to set it up for you. But it's the kind of thing that is allowing people to continue interacting on media where they otherwise might find themselves harassed into silence. Another researcher that I really admire in this space, Dr. Amy Zhang, she's over at the University of Washington. She ended up producing a piece of software called Squadbox. And this is designed to help people handle harassment over email. Someone starts sending you harassing email, it's a really uncomfortable experience. Squadbox lets you actually turn your email inbox over to a set of friends who pre-screen it for you. And so you give them permission, they look through your incoming mail. If there's harassing email coming in, they set it off to the side, and then they give you your inbox after the fact. Now, why doesn't Twitter include the tools that are within Block Party? Why doesn't, Google include this within Gmail? That's a really good question. And I think what Tracy and Amy would tell you is that if you had more people who experienced harassment actually designing these tools, they would build these tools into the systems in the first place. People only think about issues like this when they're at the pointy end of the stick. But we're now at the point where we've seen 5, 10 years of this stuff. And it feels very reasonable to be asking platforms, why aren't you doing a better job around it? When I look at work like this that's being done, I find myself wondering, as inspiring, as impressive as it is, a lot of this work is focused on fixing what's broken about a tool like Facebook, about a tool like Twitter. And the truth is, I'm not sure that it makes sense for academics and volunteers to be doing this work, given that one of the world's most powerful companies isn't actually doing the work themselves. I wonder if we're actually missing an opportunity to go a little bit further and start imagining something better. And that's sort of the next set of people I want to introduce you to. Up there is my friend Ezra Al-Shafai. There's a reason she's here as a cartoon. She's a human rights activist in Bahrain. It's actually very dangerous for her to share her photo. I've met her several times in person. I happen to know that she actually kind of looks quite a bit like that sketch of her. But that sketch actually has to do with one of the projects she runs. Ezra is queer. That is not an easy thing to be in the Persian Gulf. Bahrain, shares a border with Saudi Arabia. It's a very conservative country. She started some years ago a community called awa.org. And AWA is a space expressly for LGBTQIA folk in the Middle East. And what's interesting about it is that it runs very differently than you expect a social network to run. First of all, you can't post any pictures to it. Why? Because it's pretty common for police in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries in that region to go onto social media to find conversations about gay and lesbian issues and then download all the photos and then just arrest everybody who's in the conversation. That's quite common. So AWA doesn't let you post photos. It has you post cartoons instead. You can't join this network by just saying, this is cool, I want to join. You have to be invited. And when you're invited, you actually have to participate in a few conversations before you can sort of start your own thread. These aren't necessarily the rules that you would want everyone to live by on social networks, but specifically for queer youth in the Middle East, these might be exactly the sort of rules that you need to live by. And part of what I'm really interested in is people who are trying out different rules for social media, different ways of sort of solving these problems. One a little bit closer to home is my friend Michael Wood Lewis, who's up in Vermont. Front Porch Forum has become this incredibly successful alternative to local social networks like Nextdoor. And whereas Nextdoor tends to have a lot of reports of racism, anger, hatred on it, Front Porch Forum is a remarkably nice place. And when you look at why Front Porch Forum has been successful, one of the things that you notice is that it's just structured very differently. When you post on it, you don't actually see your post go live for at least 24 hours. Your post goes via email to a moderator. And the moderator feels like what you're saying is out of line, she or he might get back to you and have a discussion about whether we want to post it or not. They go out once a day in a batch email for people to interact with. And it's been incredibly successful. There's something like 25% of all Vermont households now on Front Porch Forum. And it's not dealt with many of the same problems that things like Nextdoor have. Now, people always ask the question, maybe it's just Vermont, maybe it's just nice. What's interesting is people have been saying that to Michael ever since he started this as a neighborhood mailing list in his corner of Burlington. Oh, it works in that neighborhood, it'll never work across the city. Oh, well, it works in Burlington, it'll never work in the rest of the state. And actually, it's continued to scale, but it's done it by growing very, very slowly and really growing a little bit at a time, sort of sacrificing growth for high quality community. Here's another network that's interesting and growing slowly. Jimmy Wales, the guy who founded Wikipedia, he's tried a bunch of other projects. One of his most recent ones is called WT Social. At a moment where Facebook and other social networks are really concerned about conversations over news, WT Social actually is focused specifically around news. It tries to host the conversations around what news is sort of coming out today. It's not advertising based. In fact, it's subscription based. If you're joining it, you're actually going to pay for the service. And it's growing slowly, but it's growing steadily. And they're trying to figure out over time how to deal with this question of the news that people are most interested in is often the most outrageous, the most sort of emotionally laden news. In fact, what he's really trying to do is optimize for conversation about really serious news. And he'll freely admit that he doesn't have this solved yet, but that it's a worthwhile problem to try to solve. One of the things I'm really interested in this space is communities that work on governing themselves. And some of the best examples of this are actually around Reddit. A lot of people think of Reddit as a cesspool, one of the nastier corners of the internet. A student of mine recently put it, Reddit is actually like America, which is to say there's corners of it that can be pretty depressing and pretty alienating, and lots of it that's actually pretty terrific. I think of it more as 197,000 separate pools, a few of which are cesspools and tend to give the whole thing a bit of an odor, but many of which actually turn out to be very high functioning communities. One of the most high functioning is the r/science community. There's more than 1,100 moderators in a community of more than 13 million people reading this every day. And it's a community with very strict rules. You can't participate except by posting peer-reviewed science. And not only is this community pretty healthy at governing itself, it's now going further and running experiments on itself with the help of this guy, Dr. Nathan Matias over at Cornell, who is helping this community organize experiments in self-governance. So they actually look at things like, how are the different ways we could welcome someone new in this community? Do we hit them with our rules page? Do we have a one-on-one discussion with them? Do we slap their hands the first time they do something wrong? And they're going out and sort of testing all of these things individually and then giving feedback back to the community so it can do a better job of governing itself. So where I come into all of this is I'm really interested in this idea of building social media that just follows really different rules. I'm not particularly interested in building the next Facebook. I think one of Facebook's big problems is that it's trying to serve a community, quote unquote, of almost 3 billion people. And such a thing doesn't exist. Communities exist for 20 people, maybe 200, perhaps 2,000 at a stretch. But that's not a community when you're dealing with 3 billion people. Those are just users of the same tool. Communities are groups of people who get together united by a common interest, united by a common problem. And so having social media where we can have lots and lots of small communities that can interact with one another is a good way to go. Some of these communities might even be sort of public in spirit. We might tie them to things like local governance or tie them to social values like diversity, introducing us to people who we don't necessarily share opinions with, but having worthwhile conversations. And I'm a big believer that these networks need to be participatory in governance, not only to figure out how to scale them, but also because we as citizens really benefit from being involved with governing these spaces and getting that lesson in democracy. The goal would be to have lots of these different communities. You might join a few of them, but you would access them through a common tool. And the tool that you'd access them through, by the way, would also allow you to access existing social media and have more control over it. We pioneered this tool over at MIT. I'm now continuing development of it over at UMass. It's called Gobo. It's a tool that lets you, at the moment, look at Twitter and Mastodon and Facebook through the same tool and have some control. You can say, you know what, I want to see the funny stuff today. Let me put a slider over here and show me the funny material. Or I'd really like to hear from the women in my community. Let me mute some of the men. Let me hear more female voices. I don't hear enough from people on the right. Let me add some right-wing news in there or some left-wing news in there. We're going to take this and expand this further so that it's interoperable with existing social networks, but also with these new small social networks that we're starting to build in conjunction with real world communities. So how do you pay for all of this? That's a good question. And here I find myself turning to Paul Romer, pretty bright guy, won the Nobel in economics recently. And one of the things Romer suggests is that because surveillance technology is bad for us as a society, because it is forcing us into these really unhealthy relationships with companies, we might actually want to throw a tax on it. And one of the things that I would suggest that we might want to do with that tax is use it to create something like a corporation for public broadcasting, where we invest in building these new sorts of infrastructures. And it turns out that even with a very modest tax, these companies make so much money on surveillance advertising that even a 1% tax would create more money than is currently given to and spent by the major organizations that you can think of as advocating for a free, open, and better internet. So look, I'm talking about a bunch of people trying a really ambitious set of interventions against some incredibly powerful and entrenched players. And you would be absolutely right to think that this is unrealistic. But I find myself in many ways very much inspired by the parachute that recently dropped the rover to the surface of Mars. And many of you probably know this story. People wondered about this weird asymmetric pattern on the parachute. And it turns out you want your parachute pattern to be asymmetric. It helps you figure out how much it's rotated, how much something is spun. But this one also turns out to be in code. And in code, it says, "Dare mighty things." And that makes a lot of sense. If you're going to be optimistic and arrogant enough to put a rover and a helicopter on the surface of Mars, you are in fact daring some mighty things. I actually think this is something that we should all be thinking about right now as we look at the internet as it is. We need to dare some mighty things to try to make this space significantly better than it is right now. And right now, our problem, if anything, is that we tend to think too small, and we actually should be thinking a little bit bigger. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'm happy to have a little conversation here. I'm also happy to take this offline and sort of talk in other channels. But thanks for the attention, and I hope we get a chance to talk at least a little bit about this.
Thank you, Ethan. That was awesome.
So how do we want to do Q&A? Do you want to hang out in the chat? Does someone want to handle questions? How do we want to think about this?
We do have a chat.
Do you want to let people put hands up? I mean, what you've been doing this today. I'm just joining you now.
Yeah, we've got the participants window open. You could raise your hand.
I'll just jump in here with a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, Eric. That'd be great.
So I'm really curious. You know, you're surrounded by a lot of college students who are in very thoughtful frames of mind, like their entire world is about challenging conventions and norms and coming up with the next great ideas. What kind of dynamics are you kind of seeing and experiencing with these kids who are going through these just incredible life-changing years and trying to think about like where their world is headed? And you know, younger kids, like my kids are in kind of high school, early college, and they never even went to Facebook. Like, I'm not even going to go there. They went like Snapchat and things like that. I'm kind of curious what sort of sentiments and attitudes you're seeing from these next great, you know, leaders of our times.
Sure. So I work with a lot of grad students, but I also do get to hang out with a lot of undergrads. In some ways, my recent experience is probably more from MIT, where I spent the last 9 years, than from UMass, where I really just started recently. I would say that I sort of get two categories of students who I end up hearing a lot from. One category sees entrepreneurship as like sort of an unblemished good, right? Like, this is clearly the way to change the world. And in some senses, they're not wrong, right? If you can find a way to make social change through entrepreneurship, it's kind of great in that it pays for itself. And you can argue that, you know, people building better electric cars, people building climate change solutions and making money at the same time is pretty cool if you can pull it off. What I find is that some of those folk are not particularly thoughtful about what's going to make money and sort of what's going to go out there on the market. There's another category of kids that I end up spending a decent amount of time with who are interested in what's, you know, sort of starting to be called public interest technology. There's actually a university network these days right now called PyTune, the Public Interest Technology University Network. And these are people who want to be geeky, who want to be really deeply involved with tech, but want to use it for social change in one fashion or another. And those tend to be the students who are sort of getting involved with Joy Bullin-Winnie's work and sort of trying to figure out, how do we audit these algorithms? Often they're experimenting with new sorts of social networks, you know, sort of new things around the edges. But they're also really interested in sort of connecting with civil rights groups, all sorts of other social change groups. and helping them deal with technology. So I feel a little unease sometimes with the first group of students. I feel a lot of excitement and enthusiasm from the second group of students. What I worry about with both is that they tend to be pretty incremental. And this is one of the things that I'm now trying to work on as a professor, is to try to get people to think actually quite big. One of the luxuries that I have is, there was really no web in 1994 when I started working on building web pages. And so this idea that someone would build a new search engine or someone would build a new social media service, that's pretty easy for me to get my head around. It's not always very easy for my students to get their head around. And so a lot of what I end up doing is trying to sort of unpack like how we got here, and thinking about the idea that the people who built these things were not necessarily geniuses. In some cases, they were actually, kind of dumb, and they just got lucky in sort of being in the right place at the right time. And so just trying to make this whole process of having impact at scale feel more achievable and more believable.
All right. The next question that I see on the timeline, because they all kind of poured in on different channels, is one from Cheryl about how do we move from free to subscription based. Cheryl, do you still have that question? Should we go to that one next?
It's a great question.
All right. So the rest of it is how do we move from free to subscription based services while including everyone? Our moderator is the only answer. There it is.
Well, so let's unpack a couple of things there, right? So one of the reasons why historically we've been worried about subscription solutions is that not everybody has money to pay for a subscription. And so, our feeling when we started Tripod all these years ago was that we wanted people who wouldn't be able to pay for a web page to have a web page. And we considered that, we were being politically open by letting people in Malaysia who were never going to make any advertising money off of, have homepages on our server. And there is a real argument that that's true, right? That you don't want to restrict access to things because there's people who need the services but don't always get the services. There are alternatives though. Public radio works through a membership model. And in the membership model, public radio knows that 98% of the listeners aren't going to pay for the programming, but they count on the 2% of people who do pay for the programming to subsidize everybody else. And I actually think that's not a bad way to think about subscription models. One way to get there would be to actually mandate it, right? We know what Facebook's average revenue per user is. It's not that much. It's like in the neighborhood of like $30 or $40 a year. You could imagine essentially saying, look, as a company, you have to offer ad-free, tracking-free subscription for 2x, 3x of what that is. So maybe you have to offer $100 a year for Facebook, and maybe some people would do it and maybe some people wouldn't. I probably wouldn't for Facebook. I probably would for Twitter. But what's interesting is those companies will not do it voluntarily. And the reason they won't do it voluntarily is it changes their appeal to the marketplace. If you are suddenly making, $60 per year per user, and then you figure out how much you're spending to support those users, it's a small linear growth business. It just can't get that much bigger. Whereas if what you're doing is collecting all the data that there is out there, you can tell the market, just wait. I now know so much about Zuckerman that you will not believe how well I can advertise to him. And the valuations of these companies are based around that sort of claim of future advertising. They're not actually based around any sort of rational projection of revenue that you're currently getting off the users. You're paying for that ad growth rather than paying for the subscription. So if we see this happen, it's going to happen, much more from new services like Jimmy's WT Social coming online. You're probably not going to see Facebook or Twitter signing up to do it anytime soon.
Well, Next question, how is a tax different from the idea of government regulation, which we said at the start was not effective?
So Romer style taxes are designed to be like cigarette taxes. They're designed to sort of say, hey, we don't love this business model. And we're going to try to find a way to discourage people from using this model. But the flip side to it is that you're trying to do it in a very general sense. So rather than regulating in the sense of, okay, here is the federal definition of hate speech, and we're going to sort of call it off here, what you're trying to do is sort of put brakes on the whole business model of surveillance. And then the goal is, in the same way that we use tobacco taxes to try to deal with programs to help people stop smoking, you might try to take that money and use it to advocate for new models for social media that are less surveillance and are less ad dependent. So what I'm particularly worried about is restriction of speech. I think it's an incredibly tricky area. I think restricting business models is actually not nearly as problematic. And certainly we've seen people are asking questions in the chat about Europe versus the US. Europe has been much, much more willing to restrict data collection than the US has been. Europe tends to have a much stronger tradition of a right to privacy. We tend to have a stronger tradition of a right to speech. And so we end up sort of saying that your ability to track me around the web is a form of speech. And I think that ends up being sort of a spurious argument at a certain point. I don't think it's particularly problematic to go after certain types of advertising and essentially saying that it's fine to look for my intent. If I go to Google and say, I'm looking for a roofer in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, selling that information to a roofer makes a lot of sense. Trying to figure out that I'm a 48-year-old man and that I visit the following websites and that I'm active online at the following times, and therefore I probably need roofing services, that's probably not the best business model. And that might be the one that we sort of end up discouraging.
Cool. Next one came in from Lisi Frecolosi. And the question is, I'm curious if you have any familiarity with the work of Cal Newport, in particular his book Digital Minimalism, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know that book specifically. I know some other books that are sort of thinking about other approaches to design. I'm a big fan of Amber Case, who writes about calm technologies and sort of working with tech in a way where, rather than responding to the technology all the time, we have control over how the tech interacts with us, and we have control over when we are going to be interrupted and how we're going to interact with these systems. So I'm interested in some of those ideas, but I don't know that work specifically, and I apologize if I'm making a bad guess about what it's about.
So we're at 2 p.m. with 1 minute. I guess the question is, do we squeeze in?
Absolutely, squeeze one or two more in. That's fine by me.
And Rick, do you have a sense of timing? Okay,
that's good.
So the next person was Carl, has his hand raised.
All right. First of all, thank you, Ethan. This is terrific. You mentioned about laws being 5 or 10 years behind the technological problems that we're facing. My concern is that many of the solutions that we're proposing are trying to solve today's and yesterday's problems, and we're not looking at where this is headed. And I'll just pick out a couple of things that David Weinberger points out, in the realm of AI, in the realm of wearables, Internet of Things, and so on. And so by the time we solve these group issues, we're going to be chasing the next thing.
So I know David well. We're good friends. He's helped me with the last 2 books I've written. He very much in his most recent book has been influenced by the time that he's been spending in Google focused on AI systems. And I think he is maybe more of an AI fan and proponent than maybe I am these days, based on spending a lot of time with people who are sort of critiquing these systems. I think one of the things that I would argue is that these systems are not necessarily inevitable. We're actually seeing around AI very specifically remarkable amounts of resistance to it. We've had several Massachusetts cities actually ban facial recognition use by police. And that's something that I think would have been extremely surprising a couple of years ago. But I think what's happened is that we've seen such clear evidence that AI is pretty inexact and that it has real racial bias behind it in some cases. And therefore, there's been real resistance to sort of rolling these things out. A lot of the work that I'm trying to do right now is to get enough data out of the social media platforms that we can say intelligent things about whether social media as currently implemented is harming us. And if we can, does it become possible at that point to have a resistance movement like the AI resistance, which, as I said, has been remarkably ahead of the game? Even the fact that, some number of people on this call here know the name Timnit Gebru, the young woman who got fired from Google for writing a critical paper about racism embedded in language models, gives a sense for the fact that there is actually kind of a social movement going on around this. So it's funny using David specifically as an example, because I actually think of AI as one of these fields where we're starting to see enough public pressure that what might have looked like an inevitable future is actually now looking like much more of a contested future. And what I'm interested in, maybe more than everything, is helping people contest these futures. I think there's a sense in which a new technology comes out and we sort of assume that it's coming whether we like it or not. And I think what I'm starting to have real hope about is that maybe we can actually have debates about what parts of those technologies we want and which we don't, and how to deal with some of those harms before they're actually with us and in our laps.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul is next, and then if we have time, Bethany after that.
Great. Thank you, Ethan, for your comments. This is a quick one, and I apologize if you covered this. I came in a little bit late.
Don't worry about it.
But you mentioned Mastodon, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are generally on federated social media. And there's PeerTube and GNU Social and PixelFed and lots of activity in that space. I'm just wondering if you feel like that holds promise in significantly changing the balance of power in social media.
Yeah, I'm going to take on, there's also a question in the chat about Inrupt and Solid at the same time. So I'm kind of going to address those at the same time. There's been a lot of creativity around this idea of distributed social networks. There's a set of them that are mostly focused on helping people sort of run their own servers and run their own communities. There's another set of folks who have sort of drunk the blockchain juice, and they are convinced that the solution to this is that not only do we need to run our own servers, but we need to compensate everybody for creating content and voting content up and down. What's been interesting about almost all of these systems is that they've really struggled to gain significant use. And the answer is almost any system can get, a couple 10,000 users based on ideology alone, people who are just psyched about open software and want to see what's new. None of them have really crossed the sort of millions of users mark, which is where you'd have to be to kind of threaten existing social networks. My hypothesis is really sort of twofold. The first fold is that almost all of these social networks sort of say, hey, we're better than whatever else is out there. Stop using that, come use us instead. The one that sort of hasn't done that is Mastodon, which has sort of said, look, Twitter's pretty cool. Actually, we've copied all of our features from it. We want to interact with it. And they are one of the few that's actually gotten real traction. My strategy on this is to build clients that interoperate with all the existing social networks. I don't want to tell anyone to get off the networks that they're on. I want to ask them to be involved with those, but also be involved with these new networks that we're building simultaneously. And I think that that paradigm shift is going to be really important. It's not going to be easy. Cory Doctorow talks about it as adversarial interoperability. I'm going to interoperate with Facebook whether they like it or not. And they may sue me over it, and that's fine. We'll deal with that bridge when we come to it. But I think it's a much better idea than first everyone quits Facebook, then they join my network, then profit, because I just don't think that that's actually a viable model. As far as some of these new protocols that are coming out, Tim Berners-Lee is behind a new protocol called Solid. It's being built by a company called Inrupt. There's a lot to like about it. It's very thoughtful on questions of how users own their data. It's very thoughtful about how you build services on top of it. It also kind of makes your brain hurt a little bit, because the ways in which we operate now are very different from the way that Solid operates. Right now, if I go buy something from Amazon, I get the product and Amazon gets a whole bunch of data from me, where I was ordering from, where it gets shipped, what I wanted, and they can start figuring out how to market to me from there. In the Solid model, that's actually all my data, and Amazon has to forget about it after the fact. They only get what they needed to deliver me something, and then they have to forget it. And it's going to take a while to get people sort of to think about that paradigm and think about how businesses work within that paradigm. It is something that Inrupt is betting on very big clients. Their first two clients are the National Railway of India and the National Health System of the UK. It's hard to think about much bigger clients than that. What it may mean is that it's sort of 5 to 10 years before we actually see that in action. And so it's exciting, but it's sort of more distant exciting than like next week exciting. Let me just also say, for people who are interested in the Fediverse, they're interested in Inrupt, I run a podcast called Reimagining the Internet. I have interviewed a lot of these people on the podcast, including Evan Henshaw-Plath, who's building Planetary.social, including the chief trust officer of Inrupt, including Jimmy Wales, about WT Social. So we have lots of deep conversations about this, and you can find that by just looking for Reimagining the Internet on whatever podcast player you use.
Okay, maybe we can squeeze in one last one.
Go for it. Yeah.
2:10. This is from Bethany. Have you heard of input.com, and what do you think of the way?
That's Inrupt.
Oh,
Yeah, I just answered
okay.
that one.
Got it.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So we actually just posted an interview with the head of trust there. I've also written a little bit about sort of thinking within the Inrupt paradigm. And like I said, I'm hugely excited in the long run. I think it's a little tricky in the short run.
Well, all right, Ethan, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us.
My great pleasure. Really loved being with all of you. I wish you a great rest of the conference, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.